Okay, so last week we talked about economic transformations. The week before that, political transformations. For week 4, it was cultural transformations. And all of these are bound up together. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can because I also have week 5's Atlantic revolutions to cover, but it'll be in a separate video. So, the question, using your required readings from the textbooks and other sources, discuss the ways in which the new global economics and political chain and politics changes cultures. In what ways do things change for the average person anywhere in the world? Are these changes better or worse? Why? What cultures are changed the most and why? Which ones the least and why? And which changes have the most impact on us today and why? Were these changes inevitable? Why or why not? Okay, so your required sources: Frankopan chapter 13, Harari chapter 15, the textbook chapters for whichever textbook you have, and of course the multimedia that you yourself have chosen, which needs to be discussed in a separate paragraph all by itself with you explaining what it helped give to your top post, how it helped you do this discussion. All right. Discuss the ways in which the new global economics and politics changes cultures, especially those in the Western world. Well, economic, as we talked about last week, we've got mercantilism and the rise of proto-capitalism. We get Wall Street, the invention of joint stock companies. Politically, absolutism versus constitutionalism, with the Netherlands and England moving towards control of the powers of the king. Absolutism, though, on the rise, particularly in Catholic countries where Catholicism justified it. And that's another thing you can consider when you're looking at this, is that Protestantism, with perhaps the exception of some of the Germanic principalities, for the most part, Protestant countries tended to be the ones who were more inclined towards regulation of the power of the king, or the imposition of constitutions and laws that limited what the king could and couldn't do. It's also going to be from that we're going to get the emergence of democracy, particularly in the North American colonies of the Western Hemisphere. So absolutism tends to align with Catholicism because of the idea that the king is responsible to God as well, and therefore God divinely appoints the king or the royal family, the idea that there's something in the blood. With the Enlightenment and its ideas about the roles of government within individual lives, you get a thing called enlightened absolutism, which is the idea here that absolute rulers need to be doing what's best for their people, not for themselves. So this is part of where you get people like Maria Theresa of Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, um, Frederick V of Prussia, the enlightened absolute monarchs who attempted to do things to better the lives of their people. And again, with some of this, that wasn't met well. Catherine the Great attempted to do away with serfdom, but her people resented that under the fear that it meant that the government could take away their land, so they revolted against her and led her to repeal her order to do away with serfdom. All right, so how do these things affect cultures? Strangely, and for most people throughout the world, especially in Europe, things get worse. As Europeans expand into other markets, they begin to take control either directly, as they do in the Western Hemisphere, by laying claim to territory and forcing the people in that territory to submit, or indirectly by buying off local rulers to get them to force their people to do what the Europeans want, which normally has to do with the production of cash crops. And often this production of cash crops will be at the detriment of the foods the local people need to produce to eat. So it becomes very problematic, and it's one of the things that leads to the Great Bengali Famine, is that the local ruler, at the will of the British, forced his people to produce opium and not food, so many of them literally starved to death. What the local rulers usually want in exchange for this, though, are weapons, either because they are fighting against other local leaders or local rulers for territory, or for control of their own government. So it's one of those situations where the Europeans, because they have spent so much time and money producing weapons, turn around and start selling them out in return for the other products that they need. Europeans themselves were persistently at war. Starting with the Reformation itself, we get 2 centuries of religious wars in Europe, usually the Catholics against the Protestants, but in some cases, as in the 30 Years' War, um, the two big Catholic powers, France and Spain, were more afraid of each other than they were of Protestantism. So at different phases in that war, one of them would be on the side of the Protestants, mainly again because they were more scared of each other. The 30 Years' War will effectively destroy much of Central Europe, since that's where most of it was fought. Almost all European nations went through a civil war period where their competition between the Catholics and the Protestant led to open problems for the government itself. In fact, one of the interesting things is if you look at the development of constitutionalism in Britain or in England, it literally starts with the arrival of James VI of Scotland to be Queen Elizabeth's successor. He comes in and has already agreed that he will head the Protestant church, even though he himself is Catholic. But his son does not feel that he's constrained by that. And in fact, he dissolves, this would be Charles I, he dissolves Parliament, attempts to get the French to invade so that they can reimpose absolute monarchy and Catholicism on England. And this leads Parliament eventually to arresting Charles I on charges of treason and beheading him, which leads to a 13-year period where Cromwell was in charge, basically as a military dictator. Cromwell himself was Puritan, and he imposes Puritan constraints on the people of England for that period of time. All taverns were shut down. There was no gambling. There was no drinking. Everybody had to go to church every week, and if you didn't go to church, you had to provide an explanation for why. It was, you couldn't wear clothes that were any color but black, white, or gray. You couldn't wear jewelry. Women couldn't wear makeup. I mean, it was a really puritanical period, hence the reason we have that terminology. When Cromwell died, Parliament basically opted to ask Charles I's brother, his son, Charles II, who was living in France, to come in and be the king, but they placed written constraints on what he could do. And this is how the progress of constitutionalism evolves in England. It's that every time we have one of these periods where some king tries to, or queen tries to do away with the limits on their power, they end up failing, and then the next king or queen that comes in after them has to submit to even more restraints. Charles II was recalled. This is the period in English history referred to as the Restoration, because it was the restoring of the monarchy. It was also doing away with the puritanical laws. Under Charles I, taverns reopened, gambling started again, plays, theaters, entertainment recommenced, and people outdid themselves wearing high fashion and clothes of many color and investing in jewelry and all the stuff. After Charles II died, while he had a large number of children, he didn't have any legitimate children. So the title of king passed to his brother James II, who ruled for about 3 years before he attempted to do what their father Charles I had done, which was to try to get France involved in invading England to return it to Catholicism. At that point, Parliament tried to arrest him. He fled back to France, where he would die. And Parliament asked that his daughter Mary, who was married to William of Orange III, William III of Orange, in the king, literally, of the Netherlands, the Dutch republics, to come in and be the King and Queen of England. And this is referred to as a Glorious Revolution because at this point no blood was actually shed. James fled instead of trying to fight back against Parliament and the parliamentary army. And thus there was a change in the position of the monarch. There were also even more rules put in place, not the least of which was a Declaration of the Rights of Englishmen written by John Locke, which basically said that nobody, it's basically kind of like our 10 amendments to the Constitution, explicitly stating things that were the rights of Englishmen, regardless of whatever class they were. And among them were things like you couldn't be arrested without an actual charge being laid, you couldn't be held for an extended period of time in jail for no cause. You had the right to speak, had the right to any number of other things that we think of as being foundational to the idea of the rights of men or rights of humans now. At this time, it was the idea that it was checks on the power of the king, things the king could not do, and things expanding from that the aristocracy couldn't do, things that government couldn't do against the people. This is Locke, of course, of Two Treatises on Government, John Locke, who basically said when the government isn't doing what the people need for it to do, the people have a right to pick another government, basically laying the foundational principles for democracy. And it's going to start in England, even though most of what Locke's actually talking about is going to emerge in the newly formed United States after the revolution of the British colonies. All right, so outside of Europe, while all of this is going on, forced labor still persists, particularly the transatlantic slave trade, indigenous slavery and servitude, and the forcing of peoples in Asia, Southeast Asia, in areas where the British are slowly, and the Dutch are slowly taking control, forcing of the people to do what they want them to do. All right, so what cultures are changed the most and which ones the least? Western Europe, of course, sees the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. And these are three big things that do effectively begin the shift in the power of the West, air quotes around the West, in terms of being able to overcome the wealth and power of the Eastern empires. The Reformation probably had the most influence on the common man of Europe because it offered an alternative for religion. And as John Green will tell you, if you watch the crash course video on either the Crusades or any of the religious ones, religion was very significant. It was literally the social center of everyone's life. So moving from the Catholic to the Protestant had a lot to do with how it affected people on a daily level. The intellectual movements, though, like the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment, were pretty much centered in the upper classes and in what is referred to as the intelligentsia, which almost all came from the upper classes as well. There are going to be some new technological and mercantile products that will trickle down to the common man, but for the most part, the standard of living declines because they are more and more being forced to produce cash crops, with the enclosure movement, as the aristocracy tries to compensate for their lack of cash by trying to create cash and kicking people off the land. Many of the poor, now land deprived people, go to the urban areas in hopes of finding a job so that they can live. And this is going to create crowded urban conditions, unsanitary urban conditions. It's going to lay the groundwork for why, when industry begins to emerge, there's a population of people that are willing to work for very, very little because they have nothing. So you will see a better standard of living for some people who are in the trading merchant class, or in what we would think of as middle management of plantations and or the colonies, because all of the colonies literally start out as company colonies, not royal colonies. And people who are working in those we'll see some improvement in their quality of living, but at the lowest level, it's really rough. In the East, many people's standard of living lowered as they were forced by their rulers to to produce particular products. Sorry, a lot of P's there. Cotton, opium, silk, tea, spices, all of the cash crop things in exchange for European weapons. Culturally, Eastern societies may have changed the least as European religions were slow to grow in those areas, principally because of the long traditions of Confucianism and Buddhism and Hinduism in India. Islam probably made the most inroads in the East, but even it has a very traditional construction of how a society should operate. And all of them operate on what we would think of today as collectivist principles. You're doing what is best for the majority of the people, not individually for yourself. All right. What changes have the most impact on us today and why? The least and why? Well, obviously the scientific method. It is probably the biggest thing that the West produces independently and utilizes. It's the whole idea that you come up with a hypothesis, you figure out a way to test it, you publish those results so other people can do exactly the same thing over and over and over again to see if you consistently get the same result. And if you do, then yes, that means that eventually you get to some foundational understanding or acceptance of this function of science, and you can build on it. While many of the ideas that the Westerners saw in the scientific revolution itself were actually ones that they were adapting from the East, the ideas that come out in the Enlightenment are the ones that actually become the new ones. And some of these are going to include things like representational governments, individual rights, individual property, and then later economic theories such as capitalism, socialism, and communism. These are all pretty much Western in design. The cultural changes that seem to have the least effect on us today are things like absolutism, because we don't have many absolute governments anymore. We have attempts at totalitarian governments, which we'll talk about when we get to World War II. But for the most part, we don't have ideas of people being divinely appointed to rule. Mercantilism, the idea that the economy should be run by the government, and for the benefit of the government, not for the benefit of merchants, and the ideas of slavery and forced labor, fortunately. You still see remnants of those in places, but for the most part, we're trying very hard to get over that. Were these changes inevitable? Why or why not? Probably they were inevitable, but inversely, it was not expected that the Europeans would be the ones to do it, or that they would be the ones to rise to dominate. At any point in the 1600s and or 1700s, any one of the European empires could have been stopped by the Eastern empires, either individually or together. At this point in time, the balance of trade between the two was effectively the same. And in fact, Harari has some points that I'll show you in just a minute when we get into using him as a source for this. One of those maps that I love. Yes, the exchange routes. All right. So Frankopan in chapter 13 is talking about England under Elizabeth and the need for Elizabeth as a Protestant nation to reach out and make trade connections with other peoples outside of the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French. So the Ottomans particularly, because as Frankopan discussed in chapter 12, the Ottomans and the Venetians have dominated the Mediterranean trade networks, moving goods, through the Mediterranean. With the decline of the Italian city-states, Elizabeth reaches out to the Ottomans to try to connect from that side. England under Elizabeth also attempted trade with China, Russia, Safavid Persia, and any of the other Eastern empires that they could find. This is, again, I'm pointing out to you the citation form. Notice that I have the page numbers in here because you need to have those as well. Inflation in Europe, another thing that led to the decline in the standard of living for many common people, created a lot of pressure on the lower classes. This coupled with religious divisions to create war and oppression for many, again, out of Frankopan, basically supporting what your textbooks have said. The Dutch emerge as a major European power, building an expansive trading post empire that pushes the Portuguese out of Southeast Asia and creates a Dutch golden age. And Frankopan talks about this in detail, using art as one of the history of Dutch masterpieces, the great masters, many of whom come out of the Netherlands in this period. But I think this is a big part of what sets Frankopan apart in terms of how he views this period. European warfare, however, had an even more important role. It promoted the rise of the West. But it was Europe's entrenched relationship with violence and militarism that allowed it to place itself at the center of the world after the great expeditions of the 1490s. And this is basically his answer to why Europe. Northern Europe, particularly England and the Dutch, replaced Southern Europe, principally the Italian city-states, as the dominant traders and empires in this period. And again, that couples in with the religious changes, with the rise of mercantilism, and with what is starting in the Netherlands, the idea of joint stock companies and the emergence of capitalism. For Harari, the scientific revolution and modern imperialism were inseparable, and this was his thesis in chapter 15. Why Europe? Well, he answers it flat out. Yet even then, 1500 to 1750, Europe was no match for the great powers of Asia. Europeans managed to conquer America and gain supremacy at sea because of the Asiatic powers showed little interest in them. In 1775, Asia accounted for 80% of the world economy. The combined economies of India and China alone represented 2/3 of global production. Europe was an economic dwarf. Okay, so this is explaining to you what the situation was in terms of economics in the latter 1700s. But then why not these Eastern powers? They, the Chinese and Persians, lacked the values, myths, judicial apparatus, and socio-political structures that took centuries to form and mature in the West, and which could not be copied and internalized rapidly. Okay, so his argument is that it's effectively something we would think of today as culture. In the early modern period, Europe developed modern science and capitalism, which laid the foundation for their global domination after 1850. Europeans explored and conquered, a phrase Harari uses on page 286, which was a new way of creating empire. And he does a very good job talking about that throughout that chapter. The discovery of the Western Hemisphere drove Europe to compete with each other for technology to control it and to admit that the old ways of thinking were not working. Zheng He represented the Chinese view of exploration, which, again, Zheng He, great guy, goes out, sees a lot of the world, takes these huge, huge ships with him to bring back animals to the Chinese emperor, but he's not about conquering them. He just wants to explore. The native peoples of America were not the only ones to pay a heavy price for their parochial outlook. The great empires of Asia, the Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, and Chinese, very quickly heard that Europeans had discovered something big, yet they displayed little interest in these discoveries. They continued to believe that the world revolved around Asia and made no attempt to compete with the Europeans for control of America or the new ocean lanes in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So effectively what Harari is saying is Europe won because Europe got out there and explored and conquered, and also began pushing into the economic sides of these great other empires. And then eventually that's going to lead them to world dominance. All right, so this is the cultural transformations. And obviously the cultures that literally are changing the most are the ones of the West, air quotes again around that, meaning Western Europe and her colonial possessions, which basically takes in all of the Western Hemisphere, and by 1900 also very much of the South Pacific, including Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, and all of the other island societies that exist there. They will begin to make inroads through company means into India, into Southeast Asia, and eventually into China as well. Okay, that is week 4, cultural transformations. And again, I wanted to include the things that I saw in Frankopan and Harari that work with that discussion point, because a lot of you just seem to be picking random quotes out of the book to support what you're saying. It's like, no, read the text holistically. Think about what they're actually arguing in the big picture. All right, I'm going to stop this video and I'm going to do one for week 5 on the transatlantic revolutions next.